First John speaks a lot about how we are to act and emulate Jesus in his own act of sacrifice for us. In a few verses before this, and I'm not remembering now which verse it was, but I tend to read on what's either side, it talks about how often the world hates us, meaning Christians. And I think that is to remind us that there's a way of the world and there's a way of Christianity. And there are often times when the way of Jesus is opposed to the way of the world. And when I think of at least one of the many ways the world promotes how you're supposed to live your life, it seems like a message we hear a lot is that you are on your own. You need to take care of yourself. And you need to do whatever it takes to get ahead. And the rewards of wealth and success are are more important than anything else, and so you set aside everything else to get ahead. That's probably the most dramatic message opposed to Christ. And in fact, if we look at the way of the world, we could, all of us, come up with many of examples of people who have come to worldly power and worldly wealth by basically responding to this meism, whatever it takes for me to be powerful and strong and wealthy. If you look back at history, you have people like the Vanderbilts, which became a very well-known and wealthy family and respected at one point in time. They began their life, their ancestor wealth, I guess you'd call it, were pirates. The Kennedys, of course, we know a big part of our culture today, started their life at bootleggers. We look at Putin now, the head of Russia, and we find a man who was started out by frauding and robbing from his people. My daughter's taken a thing on Russia, and she says one of his first appointments was to raise food for the poor in Russia. And he took the millions of dollars that he raised for that and kept it. None of the food showed up. And so he was taking money actually out of the hands of people who were hungry. Corruption and murder. And yet, oddly enough, Putin has become a supporter of the church revitalizing itself. I think perhaps we can suspect he has motivations beyond Jesus Christ in his revival. And you could probably make your own list. I mean, it's not that everybody who has wealth and power are like that, but you can find many. You can probably all make long lists of folks who seem to have risen up without any kind of moral qualms at all. In fact, it becomes sort of irritating sometimes when you think you're living a good life and you see this person who raises to a place of importance on me-firstism. Here is Jesus suggesting something very, very opposed to that. He says he lays down his life for others. And in fact, a couple of these scriptures talk about Jesus laying down his life for others totally by his choice, without any kind of payment back. And at the same time, encouraging us to do the same. His words, and one piece of that I think is very, to me at least, is very forceful speaking. He says when you lay down your life, when you do for others, when you help those who are poor and struggling, if you give to your neighbor who has not enough, you have passed, I love this imagery, you have passed out of death into life. When you live with Christ and give to others, you pass out of life to death. But she who does not love his brother and sister abides in death. To love is already life. To not love is to abide in love, or to abide in death. So we see this image of offering ourselves up for others. Now, that doesn't always have to be in ways where we actually give our lives, but it's often giving a part of ourselves for others. I just watched on the news last week sometime, I think it was the beginning of the Drake relays. They have a mile run or something. And there was a lady from Mitchellville. Maybe some of you know this lady from Mitchellville, who has some kind of physical disability that's come on her in later life, and she lost her ability to walk. Only the last 2 years, she's been trying to get back and walk. And so I think last year and this year, she competed in this 1 mile walk. So when you just hear that story, you go, well, there's a woman with a lot of courage and enthusiasm to overcome horrible obstacles. But when they showed this clip on the news, the part that impressed me was less her, though that was certainly a powerful and heroic movement. But in order to make this mile walk, she had a walker that was helping her along. And if you know how you walk on a walker, it's kind of a one step that way and another step that way, because it's very difficult for her to move each foot at a time. But here's the part that impressed me. On either side of the walker was someone steadying the walker. There was somebody off to the side that had a wheelchair in case she couldn't make it, or I suppose even when she got to the end of the mile and she had to finally stop and sit down. And there was somebody else, I think, along coaching, and I think maybe the one that caught me the most in terms of a sacrificial kind of a giving was the woman who was walking behind her, and she had one of those belts that goes around to steady somebody. So she had a belt to steady her, and there's a woman behind her hanging on to that. And in order to do that, she has to walk in rhythm with her. So here's this woman helping her walk and walking with her at her pace and in her rhythm to help to maintain her balance. So here she is. It's her strength, and yet here are 3 or 4, I think maybe there were even 5 people helping her accomplish this task. Now, to me, that speaks of what Jesus has in mind when he talks about us offering ourselves to help others. And reminds me that as we go through life, it is not something we do on our own. It's something we do as community. We need other people to help us. And sometimes we're the helper, and sometimes we're the one being helped. We have a myth, I think, and I think of it as a myth, about how individuals can raise themselves up by their own bootstraps, when in point of fact, we are accomplish what we accomplish when we help each other, when we're part of community. Those who live for self are already living in death, if we go back to the scripture. Those who die for others are already living in eternity. This idea of what makes us, I think, great in the United States, and what makes any vibrant community or culture, is when a community that knows that we need one another, even though we have that myth about everybody on their own, lift yourself up, the reality is it's when we hold each other up and help each other that we accomplish so much. We're a vital community because people engage in making this culture function and work in various ways. We become an incredibly complex. Sometimes it seems too complex. But I don't know about you, but I always sort of think of it as kind of a miracle. When I'm in Arkansas and I buy gas and I put my credit card in, and immediately it's charged to me back home. And usually it's done correctly. There's not a mistake. I guess maybe once in every 1,000 processes of that, I've had 1 or 2 errors but the company always fixes it. But what I'm amazing is something you do here is already known about back home. Now, doesn't that seem miraculous to you? It does to me. But that's because it's not just about computers. That's about hundreds and thousands of people throughout the culture working together to make everything function. All that stuff requires lots and lots of people doing their job. Now, if we read the newspaper, you always read about the people not doing their job, the people that fall on the side, the people that are robbing people, and that seems to make the news. But the reality, things work fairly well most of the time, and it's because every individual's participating. And it's not all about the pay. I mean, the story I told you about Mitchellville talks about how much people volunteer. People want to participate. They want to be engaged. And yeah, there are cultures that are relatively successful and there are more oppressive regimes, but really the power and beauty of a culture is when everybody feels engaged and a part of that. Now, I know we don't, as a country, always feel like that and people feel left out, but it seems like mostly people feel like they have the opportunity. If we create an opportunity where everyone is engaged, and we know it won't work if everybody's not engaged. I also, as I think about how we work together as teamwork is, of course, another way we often talk about that. That's kind of a limited thing we apply to sports. I'm reading this book now 2 years before the Mass, and you always have to get a little bit of book review from me. But 2 years before the Mass is a book that was written about a sailor in 1840, and he journals his journey on a sailing ship. Now, the real reason I picked up this book was because the author's name is Dana, but that's why I picked it up. But it's an interesting, but what you find out if you read about sailing ships is they cannot function without a team. Everybody has to be in their place. They all have to participate. These sails are going up and strings are being tied. You know, half the time he's talking about what they're doing, I'm going, I don't even know what he's talking about, except that it's everybody has a role and everybody has to meet it. Now, of course, on sailing ships, discipline was a little bit more enforced. You may be volunteered to get on the ship, but once you're there, there's pretty strong discipline to say you will be here doing what you need to be doing now. And that's a little opposed to what I hear Jesus saying, because Jesus is saying we participate in what needs to happen because we want to be there, because we are a part of the whole. And I think, in fact, the ship mostly worked because they knew that was true. In fact, he makes a comment about the first mate is a little lax on discipline. And actually, in the long run, that makes the whole system kind of fall apart when someone doesn't quite do the job exactly like they're supposed to do. So we need each other to function. A few years ago, and this is where I experienced this, how we help each other most dramatic. A few years ago, I did a couple of backpacking. I helped lead conference backpacking trips up in the Rocky Mountains. And the first one that I ever did, I actually took about 5 youth from my church in Rockwell City. And I gave them a couple of choices, and that's what they chose. Now, one of the girls in that just loved backpacking. I think she's been backpacking ever since. And she just thought it was the most wonderful experience she ever had. Another girl who actually came with her brother, they came together on that trip, she hated it. We were about 15 minutes into this, and she sat down on the side of the trail and flung her pack off on the side and said, "I'm done." Well, you know, you're barely started, so it wasn't quite possible to be done. But her brother, who was a very strong young man, he picked up her pack and put it up over his pack and back and carried it like this for about another hour. He said, "Well, I'll help. I'll make sure it happens." And so we went on a little while longer. Eventually, though, as you can imagine, that got a little wearing on him. So we divided the pack up, gave some of it back to her because we felt like she had to carry some of her own weight, and divided up among some of the stronger young men mostly in it. And we proceeded on. We were almost to our campsite that night when the guy who was not from my group, who was had come as kind of part of his beginning training for football in Omaha, I think was where he was from. And he sat down. He actually finished carrying the load he had, but he sat down for a while and started whining and complaining about how he had to carry too much of somebody else's load because it kind of got to him. I mean, backpacking is, you're getting everything. But what made it work, so you see a little bit of that whole dichotomy of what life is like. Sometimes you have to carry somebody else's load. Sometimes you do feel good about that. Sometimes you don't feel so good about that. But in order to get to the top of the mountain, if you want everybody to make it, now I guess in life sometimes we're willing to leave somebody at the bottom of the mountain, but I didn't think that was the appropriate response for me at the time. But in fact, I had Maggie, I took her one year, and she sat down the road at some place and said, "Just leave me here to die. I'm done." So I didn't do that either. And in her case, we just went slower, and she did okay. So you have to kind of set that rhythm. But we work together when we offer ourselves up to be a part of the whole. It's not something we do on our own. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I lay down my life of my choice, and I pick it up again of my choice." And I think this becomes a powerful part of what Jesus is saying. It's sometimes we begrudgingly help others. Jesus is saying when you see someone in need in some way that you can be a part of that life and enhance the way the world is put together, to offer yourself up, not begrudgingly, but to offer it, to do it, and to not do it. Make it be on your own. The Jesus message, I start with one personal sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, which, of course, we can never replicate entirely. What Jesus did is, of course, something none of us will ever do exactly as he did in quite as dramatic or a huge a way. But he, even in these words, is suggesting we have our ways that we can offer ourselves, lay down our lives, give our work and our efforts to help others when we see the need. Jesus, I think, gives us both a model of how we are to be, but he also, as we're reminded in the gospel, empowers us. 1 John gives the model, and that really is the whole of 1 John. If you read through that, is how do we live our lives for Christ. But empowerment is expressed in the book of Acts, where Peter is on trial before the authorities. I don't know if it's official trial, but they're questioning him on who gave you this authority. And what they're challenging him on is helping other people. He was healing other people, or I think one person, as the story goes, and that's what he was arrested for. And they say, whose authority do you have to heal somebody? And Peter says, well, what difference does it make? I was helping somebody out. I was being kind to them. But really his point is I was able to heal because Jesus empowered me. And same as Jesus empowers us. So we get a model from 1 John, but Acts reminds us that we are empowered to do sacrificial work because of Jesus. Jesus is the model, is the good shepherd who cares for those in his care and also those who may be in his care. He models what leadership and participation is about, to be a good shepherd, or maybe sometimes to be a good sheep too. As opposed to the wolf or the hireling who lets the wolf come, and the hireling who takes off when danger comes, the hireling who gives up and leaves the weaker ones to fend for their own if it's not to his interest. That first meism view of the world model. But Christ offers another model. But 1 John reminds us that when we follow Christ, it's not about the words we speak, but the deeds we do. Worship me in deed and in truth. We are called to live in the model of Jesus, even when it opposes the logic of the world, knowing that the model of Jesus always defaults to love your neighbor, at least equal to yourself. Now, I say at least equal to yourself, but if you look at Jesus, he really gives us the example of offering himself, giving more of himself than he receives back. So really the challenge is not just to give and take in kind of a balance, but to give more of ourselves. Now, I want to suggest, though, given human nature, that sometimes we have to give more of ourselves to others, more than we think they deserve, in order to come out equal. In Psychology Today, many years ago, I read this article, and it's just stuck in my mind, and they'd done a study. They surveyed marriages, and they had a survey of marriages that had continued to work and stay together, and they surveyed people who were in marriages that had ended in divorce. And on both of them, they found out, they asked each spouse who does the most. So they asked the husband, who does most of the work? Who does more to make sure things work and are held together in the family? And the husband would say, well, I probably do about 70%. Yeah, you see. Okay, now the rest of the story, Diane. But then they asked the wife, and she said, I give about 70%. I think I do about 70%, and he does the rest of it. And what was the difference between the marriages that worked and the marriages that didn't wasn't how much they thought they were giving, but that they didn't care that they were giving more. The difference in the ones that worked was they thought they were doing 70%, but they didn't care because they loved the person enough. They said, I don't mind doing 70% for the other one. I love them that much. So the reason I share that as an illustration here is that when we're given 70%, odds are it may be more 50-50. Because our perception is we're doing more, isn't it? Isn't that how most of us are? Maybe that's just me. I don't think so. But so Jesus says, give of yourself for others. Whenever you have a chance, give for others. And all three of our scriptures emphasized that image today. Sacrificing for others, going the extra mile to help someone who needs a little lift. And in fact, also always remember the other side of that, to be willing to accept when someone offers you that help too. So remember that when we love in deed and in truth, I take you back to that other image When we love in deed and in truth, we have passed out of death and abide in life. Amen. Let's share in our offering.